In 1961, Yale University ran an experiment that was supposed to take 1 hour. What it produced instead was the most disturbing finding in the history of human psychology.
Ordinary people. Good people. People exactly like you and exactly like me. Administered what they believed were potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger, simply because someone in a lab coat told them to continue. 65% of them went all the way. And when researchers looked at who these people were, they found nothing special about them at all. No history of violence, no dark personality, just ordinary human beings inside the wrong set of conditions. Today, we are going to show you exactly what those conditions are, because they are not as rare as you need them to be. So let's jump right into Section 1, the illusion of goodness.
Moving on to Section 2, the trap of authority. Now look, it's absolutely crucial to understand that as human beings, we are wired from birth to defer to authority. And honestly, it's not a weakness at all. It's actually a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. I mean, it's what made human social organization possible in the first place, right? Without it, our societies literally couldn't function. But, and this is the big catch, that very same survival mechanism can be completely hijacked.
Look closely at the physical reality of what actually happened during that famous Milgram experiment. You know, we often imagine that people doing terrible things are just these cold, unfeeling monsters. But consider the actual records. The participants in Milgram's lab sweated. They trembled. They actively pleaded with the authority figure in the lab coat to just let them stop the experiment. They were in states of intense, visceral distress. And yet, they kept pressing the button. This tells us something profound about how authority affects our moral decision-making in real time. Even when every fiber of a person's being is screaming at them that something is dead wrong, the mere presence of authority can completely override their actions. So how on earth does this happen? Well, this comparison perfectly illustrates the mechanics of what's going on inside the brain when a legitimate authority figure gives an instruction. The part of your brain responsible for moral evaluation, the voice that says, hey, this is wrong, actually partially disengages, and simultaneously, the part responsible for compliance lights right up. Now, this doesn't mean people just become mindless robots, not at all. What it means is that the psychological cost of disobedience becomes significantly higher to the brain than the psychological cost of just complying. Good people do terrible things under authority, not because their morality magically vanishes into thin air, but because the authority structure forces that morality to feel temporarily irrelevant compared to the immense pressure to obey. Which brings us to Section 3, diffusion of responsibility. When responsibility for an outcome is shared across a massive network, the individual's sense of personal accountability for that outcome shrinks dramatically. I mean, it practically vanishes. This is the exact documented psychology behind how ordinary people have participated in large-scale organized harm throughout human history. Massive atrocities. They don't just rely on a few evil individuals. They rely heavily on organizational structures that are literally designed to completely remove individual accountability. So the crucial thing to grasp is how this plays out step by step. Just look at this chain of command. No single person in this chain feels fully responsible because everyone can easily point a finger at someone else. The person at step 1 who designed the system can say, well, hey, I didn't implement it. The person at step 2 who implemented it says, I never gave the actual order. The person at step 3 giving the order says, I didn't pull the trigger. And the person at step 4 pulling the trigger simply says, I was just following orders. Every single link in this chain has a built-in psychological excuse to shift the moral weight over to someone else. And in that dark space between the links, that's exactly where ordinary people execute actions they would never ever dream of doing on their own.
Let's move to Section 4, path of gradual escalation. We love to think of evil as this sudden, dramatic plunge off a cliff, right? But the truth is, almost nobody goes from being a completely good person to committing serious harm in a single, sudden step. That is simply not how human psychology works.
Psychologists actually have a very specific name for this phenomenon. It's called the foot in the door effect. Here's how it works. You agree to something totally minor. Then, because you already agreed to that, you're asked for something slightly less minor. Each small compliance builds momentum. It acts like a benchmark, making the next, slightly larger request feel entirely reasonable by comparison.
Let's trace this timeline together, because a perfect example of this in the real world is corporate whistleblowers. When we look at massive corporate scandals, the whistleblowers almost always describe the exact same pattern. They describe a series of small, incremental compromises. A slightly altered spreadsheet here, a turn blind eye there. And each step along this timeline felt incredibly minor at the time. They felt like they were just being team players. But the escalation continues, right up until they look back and genuinely cannot identify the specific moment their actions crossed the line into serious harm. By the time the action is genuinely catastrophic, turning around actually feels more disorienting to them than just taking one more step forward.
This leads us to Section 5, the weapon of dehumanization. Now, this is perhaps the most insidious step of all. Psychology shows us quite clearly that it is almost impossible for a psychologically healthy person to cause serious, deliberate harm to someone they perceive as fully human. It completely goes against our core wiring. So before harm on a massive scale can occur, a very specific psychological bridge has to be crossed.
Consider what crossing that psychological bridge actually looks like. On one hand, perceiving someone as fully human automatically triggers empathy. But on the other hand, look at what happens when that humanity is replaced by a group label. Documented research consistently shows that before any large-scale harm occurs in history, language and categorization are weaponized. The targets are systematically talked about in ways that make them seem entirely less deserving of basic moral consideration.
So the crucial point is how this dismantling happens in practice. First, there's a gradual removal of individual identity. They're no longer a person with a family, a job, and a name. Second, they're replaced with a negative group label. They become a pest, a threat, or just a statistic. Once a person or a group has been successfully dehumanized in this way, our normal psychological barriers to causing harm simply stop functioning. The empathy that would normally flood your system and prevent you from hurting someone literally cannot attach to a target that your brain no longer recognizes as human. Finally, Section 6, protection through self-examination. Now, as we reach the end of this explainer, I really want to slow down our pacing for a moment. This is the rescue phase. The absolute most important takeaway from everything psychology has learned about why good people do terrible things is that goodness is not a fixed state. It's not some merit badge you earn once and get to wear forever. Goodness requires active, daily maintenance against these very specific conditions: authority, diffusion, escalation, and dehumanization, because they are naturally designed to erode it. The person who is absolutely certain they could never do something terrible is the person who has never examined the conditions under which their certainty would fail. And that examination is not pessimism. It is the closest thing to protection that psychology has ever found.